Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. What if I told you there's a chapter of American history that almost no one talks about? A family so hidden, so tangled in secrecy, that even the land they lived on seems reluctant to remember. For decades, whispers carried through the hollows and valleys of a bloodline shut off from the outside world, a name erased from records, their story sealed behind overgrown cemeteries and boarded windows. Most dismissed it as folklore, a ghost story for curious travelers. But what I uncovered wasn't folklore at all. It was worse, far worse. Tonight, you'll hear the buried truth of a dynasty that time, and America itself, tried to forget. A lineage locked behind mountains and silence, a story of pride curdled into shame, of children inheriting more than just their ancestors' name. This isn't the kind of history you'll read in textbooks. It's the kind passed in whispers, if it's spoken of at all, where old men lower their voices and change the subject, and where the descendants who remain still avert their eyes. As I dug into dusty archives and yellowed newsprint, a pattern emerged. It wasn't just isolation, it was intentional. A single family, holding to its own, generation after generation. You'll see why so few outside ever learned their names, and why those who did never forgot. Some secrets are buried because they protect, others because they shame. This one, it does both. By the end of this story, you'll understand why some historians call them America's most haunted bloodline. Not because of ghosts, but because of memory. Because memory itself can be a kind of haunting, and what you're about to hear has been haunting this country for over a century. The story begins deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where the hills rise like silent witnesses and the roads twist into nowhere. In the late 19th century, a small homestead stood apart from any town, any church, any outsider's eye. There, a family with an old surname lived and died, generation after generation, almost entirely cut off from the world. They farmed, hunted, and buried their own on a patch of land no stranger dared cross after dark. The few who did speak of them described an unsettling silence that hung over the place. They didn't send their children to school, didn't go to the county fair, didn't even appear in church on Easter Sunday. When census takers rode up the narrow track, the family would scatter into the woods. Yet their names, faint and misspelled, still appear in the oldest courthouse ledgers. Always the same handful of surnames, repeating over decades, as if time itself had stopped at their doorstep. But it wasn't just isolation that made their story disturbing. It was the way their pride in their own bloodline turned inward. Local rumor said they saw outsiders as a threat, not just to their way of life, but to their name. They married among their kin, generation after generation, convinced that the outside world brought ruin, that the pure family must remain whole. The walls of the mountains became the walls of their world, and no one ever asked who paid the price. When I first read the scraps of surviving correspondence between the family and a wandering preacher, the words chilled me. Phrases like, "No need for strangers," "We keep to ourselves," and "Blood stays with blood." There was an unmistakable sense that what happened on that land was never meant to leave it. They weren't ashamed, at least not then. To them it was tradition. To the rest of the world, it would become something darker, something almost too uncomfortable to confront. As the 20th century crept closer, the outside world began to change. Railroads reached further, towns grew, and with each year, the chance of discovery increased. What the townsfolk eventually found would confirm their worst suspicions and create a legend so unsettling that locals still hesitate to say the name aloud. The first outsider to document what he saw was a traveling doctor, called up the mountain in 1901 after a neighboring farmer claimed a whole brood was wasting away. His handwritten notes, preserved in a county archive, paint an image that reads more like a Gothic tale than a medical report. He described children with strange, hollow stares and adults with voices so soft they barely rose above a whisper. Their features bore the unmistakable markers of generations without new blood. Yet there was more than physical difference here. There was something almost spectral in the way they looked at him, as though they had no context for the outside world at all. The doctor wrote of homes built from rotting timber, walls patched with flour sacks and bark. He noticed no photographs, no mirrors, no books. A Bible sat unopened on a shelf coated with soot. He asked about their family names and where they came from, and the patriarch, an aged man with trembling hands, simply replied, "We've always been here. We'll always be here." The words weren't a boast. They sounded like a warning. Rumors began to seep into nearby towns, stories of babies born to sisters and brothers, stories of children who could not speak, not because they wouldn't, but because they'd never heard enough language to form words. Outsiders whispered of a curse on the family's land, and some swore that at night you could hear cries from the hollow that weren't quite human. But the truth was more complicated and more tragic. Behind the whispers and horror was a deeper question. How had a family been left so alone, so abandoned by the outside world, that their only companions were each other? No schools reached their hill, no church sought them out, no government official bothered with the wild ones up the ridge. America's march into modernity had left them behind, and the result was a secret festering in plain sight, one too painful for the county to claim and too shameful to admit. And then came the tragedy that forced their existence into the open, a death no one could ignore. When that story broke, the newspapers came running, and the legend of America's forgotten bloodline was born. The death that exposed the family's secret began with a fire. In the winter of 1910, a hard frost settled over the mountains. Food was scarce, the livestock half-starved, and an oil lamp tipped over inside the cabin one bitter night. The flames spread fast through the wooden shack, and by dawn, 3 members of the family were gone. The smoke could be seen for miles, and for the first time in years, neighbors and local authorities were forced to climb the ridge. What they found inside that burned-out cabin was more than just tragedy. The sheriff's official report described the remains of the home as unlike any dwelling in this county, with cramped sleeping quarters where a dozen family members had shared the same straw pallets. The charred remnants of the walls revealed decades of patchwork repairs, each layer older than the last. But what caught the attention of the men who came to help wasn't just the living conditions, it was the family itself. The surviving children were pale, rail-thin, and oddly silent. Some of them had never seen strangers before. One deputy wrote in his notebook that when he reached out to offer food, a young boy flinched as though the man's hand were a weapon. Their speech was fragmented, their movements hesitant, as if they were unsure how to exist outside the tight confines of their home. For the first time, outsiders began to understand that what was happening on that ridge wasn't simply poverty. It was isolation so severe it had warped an entire bloodline. The local paper got wind of the story. The headlines spoke in hushed tones: mysterious family hidden in the hills, strange children rescued after cabin fire. But the more the journalists dug, the more unsettling details emerged. Marriages between cousins, children born without proper records, and a family tree that seemed to fold in on itself like a closed loop. Some editors refused to print the worst of it, fearing backlash. Others leaned into the horror, turning a tragedy into a sideshow for distant readers who wanted to gawk at mountain folk. Yet behind the sensational headlines was a deeper story no one wanted to tell. This wasn't simply a scandal, it was an indictment. How could a modern nation let a family fall so far through the cracks that the only hands they knew were their own? The tragedy of the fire made it impossible to ignore, but what came next would be far more disturbing than any headline could convey. After the fire, the surviving family members were placed under the watch of the county. For the first time in their lives, they were moved off the ridge and into the town's custody. But the adjustment was anything but simple. Local officials, unprepared for what they saw as wild children, didn't know what to do with them. Some were sent to foster homes, others placed in institutions meant for those deemed feeble-minded, as the language of the time cruelly put it. Journalists followed their every move. The family became the subject of whispered gossip in barbershops and front porches alike. It wasn't just their appearance that fascinated outsiders. It was what they represented. Generations of secrecy had finally collided with a society that preferred not to see its own failures. The family's story was paraded as a grotesque curiosity, but few people asked the harder questions. Who let this happen? And how many other forgotten bloodlines existed, tucked away in the uncharted corners of America? The deeper reporters dug, the more unsettling truths they uncovered. The patriarch of the family, a gaunt man nearly blind from cataracts, admitted that he had married his niece. Her parents, themselves first cousins, had lived and died on that same ridge without ever leaving. Local officials found no marriage licenses, no birth certificates, and no school records. These people didn't exist on paper. They existed only in the shadows of a nation that had left them behind. But what shocked investigators most wasn't the intermarriage. It was the psychological damage. Many of the children struggled with language, their vocabulary limited to a few dozen words. Others communicated through gestures or sounds more animal than human. To the outsiders observing them, it seemed unfathomable. Yet those who spent real time with the family began to realize a darker truth. This wasn't just the result of genetics. It was neglect on a generational scale. These children had been denied the most basic human connection with the outside world, and in that void, something deeply haunting took root. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you turn away like the townsfolk did for decades, or would you have climbed that ridge sooner when there was still time to save them? As the years passed, the town tried to bury the memory of the family. The newspapers stopped printing follow-ups, the institutions closed their doors to reporters, and the county quietly erased the case from public records. To the outside world, it was as if the family never existed, but the truth lingered in the whispers of those who lived nearby, in the quiet shame of people who had seen and done nothing. One former social worker, decades later, admitted in a taped interview that she'd been warned not to talk about what happened on that ridge. "They told us it would make the county look bad," she recalled, her voice trembling even after all those years. "But what kept me up at night wasn't the politics, it was their eyes, those children's eyes. They didn't look at you like other kids. They looked through you, like they were seeing a world they knew they'd never belonged to." The trauma ran deep. Some of the children never adapted, shuttled from one facility to another, growing up as nameless wards of the state. Others vanished into the working poor, carrying with them the silent burden of a family name no one wanted to speak. There were rumors of violent outbursts, early deaths, even suicides. Each tragedy a grim echo of the isolation that had defined their bloodline for generations. But perhaps the darkest twist came years later, when genealogists uncovered something chilling. The family wasn't unique. Scattered across rural America were pockets of similar histories, families so isolated, so neglected, that their stories never made it beyond their hollers and hills. Historians estimate dozens, perhaps hundreds of forgotten bloodlines existed throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, erased not by compassion, but by society's refusal to acknowledge them. And as unsettling as it is, the question must be asked, was the family on the ridge truly an anomaly, or were they simply the ones unlucky enough to be exposed? If not for that fire, their secret would have remained buried with them, like so many others. America prides itself on progress, but behind every polished story of triumph are the ghosts of those left behind. The past doesn't stay buried, it lingers, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up, and sometimes what you find changes the way you see history and yourself forever. What remains today of the family on the ridge? The farmhouse has rotted into the earth, its beams collapsed under decades of rain and neglect. Trees have swallowed the path that once led to their door. If you stood there now, you'd never know a family lived and died in that hollow. And maybe that's the point. History has a way of hiding what it finds uncomfortable, but their story isn't just about them, it's about us. It's about the uncomfortable truth that sometimes entire communities choose silence over compassion, secrecy over justice. Descendants do exist, scattered, anonymous, living quiet lives far from that haunted ridge. Most don't carry the family name anymore. They changed it out of shame or fear, or maybe just the desire to start over. Few, if any, speak openly about where they come from, and can you blame them? Would you want the world to know that your blood carries the echoes of a forgotten tragedy, that your very existence is tied to a legacy your ancestors fought to keep hidden? But here's the haunting part. Their story forces us to ask how many other bloodlines have been erased from history simply because they didn't fit the narrative of a shining, prosperous America. We're told this country was built on courage and progress, yet there are valleys and hollows filled with ghosts whose voices were never heard. They weren't in history books, they weren't the heroes of documentaries, they were the shadows at the edge of our collective memory, and maybe that's why their story matters more than ever. Because remembering them forces us to face the darker side of the American dream. It forces us to ask who we choose to help and who we leave behind. The family on the ridge didn't need pity. They needed someone to climb that hill before it was too late. No one did, and that silence became their legacy. As you close this video, take a moment and ask yourself, what stories in your own family have gone untold? What truths have been buried out of fear or shame? History isn't just dates and names, it's blood and bone, love and cruelty, silence and secrets. And some secrets, like this one, refuse to stay buried forever. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the past is closer than you think.